You know what nobody tells you about cleaning up after someone dies? The silence isn't silent. I've been doing this job for 3 years now, and every single night, I walk into rooms that still hold the last breath of someone who chose to leave this world. But tonight is different. Because tonight, at exactly 3:17 in the morning, standing in the middle of a blood-soaked bedroom with my respirator fogging up and my gloves already stained dark, something pressed its lips right against my ear and whispered, clear as glass, clear as a church bell in an empty field. It wasn't me. And I want you to stay with me right now, because what happened next in that apartment changed the way I understand death forever. Don't go anywhere. You need to hear all of this. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I do and what I saw tonight. I work for a bioremediation company. That's the technical word for it. The clean version of the job title. What it really means is this. When someone dies in a way that leaves a mess behind, when the police have taken their photos and the detectives have finished their reports and the family has been gently walked out by someone in a suit, I'm the one who gets the call. I'm the one who shows up with the industrial-grade chemicals and the hazmat suits and the black bags and the enzymatic cleaners. I'm the one who makes the room look like nothing ever happened there. I am the last person who will ever truly witness what that space held. I started this job because I needed money. That's the honest answer. I had just gotten out of a relationship that left me broke and living in a studio apartment with a broken heater and a cat that hated me. A friend of a friend told me about the work. Said it paid well. Said you got used to it. He wasn't wrong on either count, but he left out a few details. He left out the smell. He left out the way your brain starts cataloging things automatically. The knocked over coffee mug, the shoes placed neatly by the door, the reading glasses folded on the nightstand like someone was planning to come back for them. He left out the rules. Nobody ever talks about the rules. Every company in this industry has them, and ours are no different. Some of them make practical sense. You never work alone on a scene rated above a 3 on the decomposition scale. You always wear full PP regardless of how minor the cleanup appears. You photograph the room before you touch anything, so there's documentation of the state you found it in. You never, under any circumstances, read personal documents, letters, or notes left at the scene unless it becomes necessary for the cleanup itself. You bag and tag everything. You label it. You leave it for the family liaison. Those rules I understand. But then there are the other rules. The ones that get passed down from worker to worker like folklore. The ones that no supervisor ever officially tells you, but every experienced cleaner on the team knows by heart. The first one is this. You never say the name of the deceased out loud while you are inside the scene. Not once. The older guys say it stirs something up. I used to laugh at that. I don't laugh anymore. The second rule is that you never work with your back to an open doorway after midnight. You position yourself so you can always see the entry and exit points. Nobody has ever given me a clinical reason for this, but I have never met a veteran cleaner who breaks it. The third rule, and the one that matters most to tonight's story, is this one. If you hear a voice inside a scene that has been cleared of all living persons and confirmed empty, you do not respond. You do not acknowledge it. You finish what you are doing, you collect your equipment, and you leave in a calm and orderly fashion. You write it in the report as an auditory anomaly. You go home. You do not go back. I have heard 3 voices in 3 years. Tonight was the third. The call came in at 1:45 in the morning. Standard protocol. I get the address, the level classification, the general nature of the event. This one was classified as a level 2. Single room involvement. Confirmed single decedent. Male. Apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The body had already been removed. The medical examiner had come and gone. The detective assigned to the case had signed off. The building super had been contacted, given the necessary paperwork, and instructed to leave the apartment unlocked for our crew. I pulled up to the building at 2:58 a.m. It was one of those old mid-century apartment complexes that you find in the outer edges of older cities. The kind with metal mailboxes in the lobby and an elevator that smells like decades of cigarette smoke compressed into a metal box. 4 floors. The apartment was on the 3rd. I took the stairs. The hallway on the 3rd floor was long and very quiet. The overhead fluorescent light at the far end was flickering in that particular rhythm that always reminds me of a heartbeat trying to stabilize. My bag was heavy on my shoulder. My boots echoed on the linoleum. I counted the apartment numbers as I passed them. 312, 314, 316, 318. The door to 318 was slightly ajar. The building super had left it exactly as instructed. I pushed it open with my shoulder because my hands were already going into gloves, and I stepped inside and hit the wall switch with my elbow. The light came on, and I stood there for a moment, the way I always do in the first 10 seconds inside a new scene, just absorbing the layout before my brain switches into work mode. It's a habit I developed early on. My supervisor called it situational calibration. I call it giving myself a moment to be a human being before becoming a machine. The apartment was small. A single main living space with a kitchenette along one wall, a narrow bathroom off to the left, and a bedroom behind a partially open door straight ahead. The living room looked untouched. There was a couch with a green blanket folded neatly over one arm. There was a small television on a wooden stand. There was a bookshelf crammed with paperbacks, their spines cracked and soft from repeated reading. There was a coffee table with a single mug on it, and from where I was standing, I could see the tea bag string still hanging over the rim. Like someone had made tea and just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. The bedroom is where the work was. I set my bag down, opened it, pulled out my Tyvek suit, and began putting it on. Full respirator, double gloves, boot covers. I went through the checklist the way I always do, methodically, not rushing. Because in this work, the one time you rush is the one time you make a mistake that you carry home with you in ways you don't want to think about. I photographed the living room first, then moved to the bedroom doorway and photographed from there before entering. Then I stepped inside. The room was small. A single bed with a dark wooden frame, a dresser, a window with the curtains drawn, a desk in the corner with a laptop that had gone to sleep, its charging light blinking slow and steady like a patient animal, and the wall behind the headboard. That's where the level 2 classification comes from, and I won't describe it in detail because some things deserve a privacy that extends beyond death. What I will say is that the cleanup was real and it was significant, and I got to work. I set up my portable light array because the overhead fixture in the bedroom was inadequate for the detail work. I mixed my enzymatic solution. I laid out my disposal bags in order of use. And then I began, starting from the ceiling and working downward the way the protocol demands. Because gravity is your enemy in this work, and you clean against it methodically, or you create more problems than you solve. I had been working for about 45 minutes when I found the photograph. It had fallen behind the dresser, wedged between the dresser and the wall in a gap of maybe 2 inches. I only found it because I was moving the dresser slightly to clean behind it, and the photograph slid down and landed face up on the baseboard. I picked it up. It showed 2 men, maybe in their mid-30s, standing on a hiking trail somewhere with pine trees behind them. They were both smiling. They had their arms around each other's shoulders the way close friends do, or brothers. On the back of the photograph, in blue pen, someone had written a single line, a date from about 8 months ago, and then the words, "He would have done anything for me." I stood there holding that photograph for a moment longer than I should have. I put it in the personal effects bag. I sealed it. I labeled it. I went back to work. It was somewhere around 3:17 when it happened. I know the time because I had just checked my watch to calculate how much longer the primary surface treatment needed to sit before I could begin the extraction phase. I was standing at the left side of the bed, facing the wall, working with my back to the open bedroom doorway, which I know, the rule, but I had positioned my work light in a way that made it difficult to angle, and I had been lazy about repositioning myself. And that is the only explanation I have for why my back was to that door. I felt the air change first. Not a drop in temperature exactly, but a shift in density. Like the air around me suddenly had more substance to it. Like something had displaced it by entering the space. The hairs on the back of my neck, even under the Tyvek hood, rose in a single wave. And then the voice. It was male. It was low. It was not a sound that traveled across the room from a distance. It was immediate, proximate, intimate. The way a sound is when it is produced within inches of your ear. And it said, with a clarity and a specificity that my brain could not process as anything other than real, it wasn't me. 3 words. Clear. Deliberate. Steady. I stopped moving. I stopped breathing. I stood absolutely still, the way prey animals stand still, the way your body locks up before your brain has processed the threat, operating on something older and more fundamental than thought. My heart, I swear to you, skipped 2 full beats and then began hammering in a pattern I had never felt before. The rule ran through my head like a fire alarm. If you hear a voice inside a scene that has been cleared of all living persons, you do not respond. You do not acknowledge it. You finish what you are doing. You collect your equipment. You leave. I turned around slowly. I told myself I was checking the room. I told myself it was a practical safety check, not a response to the voice. I was wrong on both counts, and I knew it even as I was doing it. The room was empty. The doorway was empty. The hallway beyond was dark and still. I turned back to the wall. My hands were shaking inside the double gloves. The enzymatic solution was still sitting on the surface, still doing its work, indifferent to everything I had just experienced. And I kept working, because the job doesn't stop, because the room needs to be clean, because somewhere out there, this man's family, whoever they are, whoever was hiking with him in that photograph, whoever wrote those words on the back of it, they're going to have to come back here at some point. They're going to have to decide what to do with the green blanket and the cracked spine paperbacks and the laptop with the patient blinking light. And the least I can do, the absolute minimum human thing I can do, is make sure they don't walk into the room the way I found it. I finished the primary surface treatment. I completed the extraction phase. I did the secondary pass with the UV light the way protocol demands, checking for anything the visible spectrum work might have missed. I bagged everything. I sealed everything. I photographed the finished room. I was packing up my kit, nearly done, zipping the outer bag closed, when I had a thought I can't fully explain and can't fully dismiss. I looked at the photograph in the personal effects bag, sealed, labeled, ready for the family liaison. I thought about the 2 men on the hiking trail. I thought about the words on the back. He would have done anything for me. And I thought, what if the voice wasn't speaking to me? What if it was still speaking to him? What if it was the other man in the photograph, the one still living somewhere out there in the world tonight, who would also be hearing those words in his head on repeat, who would also be asking himself what he could have done differently, what signs he missed, what conversations he didn't have in time? What if "it wasn't me" was the last thing this man needed to say before he could go? An absolution aimed not at me, but past me, at someone the universe was using me as a temporary conduit for. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if I believe in any of it. The voices, the rules, the displacement of air, any of it. 3 years of this work, and I still haven't decided what I believe. But I know what I heard. I know the room was empty. I know the voice was real. And I know that when I walked out of that apartment at 4:23 in the morning and stood in that flickering hallway with my heavy bag on my shoulder, I felt something I had never felt walking out of a scene before. I felt like I was the only living person who had been given a message that was never meant for them. And the weight of that is something I'm still carrying right now as I'm telling you this. The tea mug was still on the coffee table when I left. The tea bag string still hanging over the rim. I almost moved it to the kitchen. I left it where it was. Some things should stay exactly where the person left them, in the exact position they chose, pointing in the exact direction they last saw. I got back in my van. I drove home in the dark. And for the first time in 3 years of this work, I didn't write auditory anomaly in my report. I left that line blank, because there was nothing anomalous about what I heard. It was the most human thing I have ever witnessed inside a scene. 3 words that someone needed to say before they could stop needing to say anything at all. And I was the only one there to receive them. Whether that was accident or intention is a question that is going to stay open in me for a very long time. Do not look away from what the darkness is trying to tell you. Sometimes the message isn't for you, but sometimes you're the only one left who can hear it. Story number 2. I need you to stop whatever you're doing right now and listen to me carefully, because I'm going to tell you something that I have not told my supervisor. I have not told my wife. I have not told anyone. Because the moment I say it out loud to someone who is not there, I have to accept that it is real, and I have been fighting that acceptance for 72 hours now. I found fingernails, not on the floor, not scattered loose. I found fingernails embedded, and I mean driven deep into the metal of the inside of a locked police transport van at 4 in the morning. And the report said the van had been empty for 6 days. And the doors had been locked from the outside the entire time. I have been a trauma cleaner for 4 years and 8 months. Before that, I worked in hospital sanitation, and before that, I did construction cleanup. And the reason I moved through those jobs in that order is that each one required a slightly higher tolerance for the things that human bodies leave behind. And somewhere along the way, I discovered that I had an unusually high tolerance for exactly that. My supervisor says I have the constitution of a man twice my size and the attention to detail of a forensic accountant. I take that as a compliment. This work demands both. Trauma cleaning is broader than people assume. It's not just crime scenes, though that's part of it. It's accident recovery scenes. It's unattended death cleanups. It's industrial accident sites. It's locations that have been subjected to violence that left biological material behind. And it's vehicle interiors. Vehicles see some of the worst of it, because vehicles are enclosed and vehicles are mobile and vehicles are used to transport people in situations that are already the worst moments of their lives. I have cleaned ambulances. I have cleaned civilian vehicles after accidents. And I have cleaned police vehicles. Many times. Including transport vans. There are rules for vehicle cleanups that are different from the rules for structure cleanups. The first rule is that you always verify with the dispatcher that the vehicle has been cleared, signed off by the relevant department, and is released for bioremediation work before you touch it. The second rule is that you always have the fleet manager or the assigned officer present for the initial access and photography, so that there is a witness to the state of the vehicle when you take possession of it. The third rule, and this is the one that becomes important tonight, is that once you begin working in an enclosed vehicle, you prop the doors. You do not clean inside a van with the doors closed. This is partly for ventilation, because the chemicals need airflow. But every cleaner I know will tell you there is another reason, too. A reason that nobody writes down in the official manual. You prop the doors because nobody wants to be sealed inside a small metal space in the middle of the night while they are cleaning something that happened in that space. And nobody talks about why that feeling exists. But it does. Every one of us has felt it. The call came in at 2:30 in the morning. The fleet yard called our dispatch because they had a transport van that had been sitting since a use of force incident 6 days prior. There had been a delay in the administrative clearance, some kind of paperwork hold that I wasn't briefed on and didn't need to know about. What I needed to know was that the van was cleared now. It was parked at the far end of the fleet yard, and the fleet manager had left the key in the lockbox on the yard office door because he wasn't going to come in at 2 in the morning for this. I noted that. I noted the absence of the second rule, the witness for initial access. I logged it in my intake form as a protocol deviation with external authorization, which is the formal way of saying this isn't technically correct, but the client confirmed it. It happens. The world doesn't always follow its own rules at 2 in the morning. I got to the fleet yard at 3:40. The lot was large and very dark at the edges, the center lit by a grid of overhead sodium lights that turned everything the color of old photographs. There were vehicles everywhere, patrol cars in ordered rows, SUVs, a few specialty units along one side. The transport van was at the very back of the lot, parked nose-in toward the chain-link fence, away from the other vehicles. I saw it from 50 yards away, and something in my chest did a thing I don't have a clinical word for. Not fear exactly. Not recognition exactly. Something in between. Like the part of your brain that processes threat was running a very quiet background calculation that hadn't surfaced to conscious thought yet, but was already influencing your body's readiness level. The van was a standard issue prisoner transport. Dark navy, almost black under those sodium lights. Heavy reinforced body. The kind with the solid metal divider between the cab and the transport compartment, with the small wire mesh window between them. The transport compartment itself had no windows to the exterior, just smooth metal walls, metal floor, metal ceiling, 2 long benches on either side with restraint bars, and a single solid door at the rear with a heavy external lock and handle. I got the key from the lockbox. I photographed the exterior of the van from all 4 sides, standard documentation. I noted the external lock on the rear door was engaged, which was consistent with protocol for a vehicle that had been secured and waiting. I unlocked it with the key from the lockbox. The door swung open. The smell was significant. 6 days in a sealed vehicle. I won't elaborate beyond that. I already had my respirator on, but I gave the interior a 2-minute airing before I began the documentation photography, because the light array works better when there isn't active vapor distortion from the compounds you're about to treat. I set up my portable light array. I climbed into the transport compartment. I positioned myself at the far end, facing the rear door, propped fully open the way the rule says, and I began the documentation photography from that position, working my way toward the divider. The biohazard area was concentrated toward the front of the compartment, near the divider wall, consistent with the incident report summary I'd been given, which described the use of force as occurring during transport. The 2 metal benches on either side were clear. The floor showed primary involvement. The lower portion of the divider wall showed secondary involvement. I documented everything systematically. I was thorough. I am always thorough. And then I began moving along the right side bench, photographing the bench itself for completeness before beginning treatment, and my light caught something on the metal wall above the bench. Indentations, scored into the metal. I leaned closer. They were parallel lines. 4 sets of them, gouged into the metal sidewall of the van, beginning at roughly bench height and extending upward approximately 18 inches, with a grouping that suggested, and my brain was slow to process this, much slower than it usually is, that suggested fingers. Specifically, the pattern and spacing and curvature of the marks were consistent with fingers dragged down a vertical surface while the hand was positioned at a reaching angle, like someone reaching upward and then being pulled away from the wall. Or like someone pressing against the wall with as much force as they could generate, and then losing traction. I told myself they were pre-existing. Vandalism. Previous transport. Boots. Maybe not fingers. I told myself this, and I moved on, and I continued photographing. And then my light hit the rear door. The inside of the rear door. I want you to understand something about this door. The rear door of a police transport van locks from the outside. The handle, the mechanism, the lock cylinder, all of it is on the exterior. From the inside of the transport compartment, the door presents as a flat expanse of heavy metal with nothing to grip, nothing to turn, nothing to engage. It is by design an exit that cannot be operated from within. That is the entire point. The inside surface of that door had marks on it. Not scratches. Not scuffs from equipment. I am looking at my photographs right now as I am telling you this, and I am using the correct word deliberately and carefully. Embedded. The fingernails were embedded in the metal of the door, not scratched across the surface, not dragged along it, driven into it, with a force and a desperation that I cannot calculate, but that my body understood immediately and viscerally when my light caught them at the right angle. There were 10 distinct nail marks, in a pattern that made anatomical sense. 2 hands, pressed against the door, fingers splayed, nails driven forward. At the height where a person sitting on the floor of the van, not on the bench, on the floor, would reach if they were pushing against that door with everything they had. The report said the van had been empty for 6 days. The report said the external lock had been engaged for the duration. The report said the incident occurred during transport and the scene had been secured immediately following. I took 16 photographs of that door. I did not touch it. I did not disturb the evidence of it. I withdrew from the transport compartment and I stood in the cold air of the fleet yard and I breathed in and out through my respirator and I made a decision. I did not call my supervisor. It was 4 a.m. and I had a job to do, and I told myself I would raise the photographs in the debrief. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself that I was there to clean, and I should clean. But I was no longer propping the door all the way open. I had the rear door fully open, and I wedged my largest equipment case against the base of it, and I angled myself so that I could see that door at all times. And I completed the treatment of the transport compartment in that configuration, watching the door, watching the propped open rectangle of dark cold sodium-lit yard beyond it, watching for anything that moved in that darkness. Nothing moved. I cleaned the compartment. I treated every surface. I bagged everything. I did the secondary UV pass. I documented the finished state. And then, before I locked the rear door and returned the key to the lockbox, I stood at the inside of that door one more time with my light. The nails were still there, exactly as I had found them, still embedded, still telling the story of a force and a duration that the incident report did not account for. Here's what I know. I know that human fingernails, even under extreme duress, cannot be driven into the gauge of steel used in police vehicle construction by hand pressure alone. I know that the external lock mechanism was confirmed and gauged upon my arrival. I know that the fleet manager did not enter the yard between the day the vehicle was secured and the night I arrived. I know that there is no official explanation for what I photographed that night. And I know one more thing. When I was packing my final bag, getting ready to exit the transport compartment for the last time, I looked up and I noticed something I had not noticed in the initial documentation phase, because it was small and it was high and my light angle during documentation had been positioned lower. On the metal ceiling of the transport compartment, scratched in letters that I had to angle my light to read clearly, were 4 words. Not words I would have used, not words I can fully account for, but words I read and recorded and have not been able to stop reading since. I was still here. That's all it said. 4 words, scratched into the ceiling of a locked van that a report told me had been empty for 6 days. Written in the past tense. Written as fact. As record. As the kind of statement a person makes not because they need someone to believe them, but because they need it to exist somewhere. Because they need it to be true in the physical world, in the metal of the thing that held them, because the paper world had already failed them. I filed my report. I submitted my photographs. I listed the nail marks and the ceiling inscription under physical anomalies requiring supervisory review. 2 days later, my supervisor called me and told me the photographs of the door and ceiling had been forwarded to the relevant department and there would be no further communication on the matter from the client. No further communication. That's what they said. I think about the 2 hands pressed against that door. I think about them constantly. I think about the angle of the fingers, the position on the floor, the decision to scratch something into the ceiling when it became clear that the door was not going to open. I think about what 6 days means in a sealed metal space. I think about the gap between what a report says and what a room, or a van, holds in its walls. The thing about trauma cleaning is that you are always the last one in. The evidence of what happened is still present, still legible when you arrive. And your job is to erase it, to make the space clean again, to make it possible for the next person to occupy that space without carrying what the space holds. That is a necessary thing. I believe it is a necessary thing. But sometimes, in the seconds between arrival and erasure, you are the only living person who reads what the space wrote. And that is a weight that does not come out with the enzymatic solution. That weight you carry home, every single time. The van went back into service, as far as I know. It was cleaned. It was certified clean. I certified it myself. And somewhere tonight it is probably sitting in a fleet yard just like the one I was in, or it is moving through a city with someone in that compartment, and the ceiling still has those 4 words on it, and nobody looking at that van from the outside would know it. And that is the part one cannot resolve. That is the part that is still embedded in me the way those nails were embedded in the door. Find the thing that refuses to be erased. That's where the truth is. Always. Story number 3. I need you to lean in close for this one, because this one is not a ghost story, and it is not a horror story in the way you might expect. And by the time I finish telling it to you, you're going to understand why those 2 facts make it so much worse than either of those things could ever be. I am a biohazard cleaner. Tonight, I am in a basement at 2 a.m., decontaminating a space that the health department flagged as uninhabitable due to biological contamination. Standard enough. But 11 minutes ago, inside a sealed plastic bin that was sitting in the corner of this basement under a pile of old newspapers that had not been moved in at least a year based on the mold pattern on the bottom sheets, I found a diary. And I have been reading it for 11 minutes. And it is describing, in present tense, a man who has been living in the shadows of this very basement. And the entries do not stop at a date in the past. The last entry is dated 3 days ago, and the basement has one way in. And I came in through it. And it is open. I work biohazard decontamination. This means I get called to places that have been declared unsafe for human occupation due to contamination, mold remediation with biological components, sites with significant rodent infestation, locations where human biological material has created an environmental hazard, illegal drug production sites where the chemical residue constitutes a health risk. It is specific, technical, highly regulated work, and it requires both physical stamina and a particular kind of mental discipline that most people underestimate until they try it. The mental discipline I'm talking about is this. You have to be able to work in spaces that have clearly been the site of prolonged human suffering, dysfunction, or isolation, without letting the narrative of that space into your head while you are working. Because if you let the story of the place start running in your mind while you are doing the technical work, your technical work suffers. You miss contamination sites. You cut corners on protocol. You rush because the story makes you want to leave. So you learn to set the story aside. You learn to look at a surface and see it as a surface and only as a surface, requiring treatment or not requiring treatment, period. You learn to be a technician first. I am a good technician. I am very good at setting the story aside. What I'm about to tell you is about the one night the story would not stay aside. The job was flagged as a level 3 mold and biological contamination. The property was a residential building that had been vacant for approximately 14 months, according to the city records. The owner was a property management company based out of another state. The health department had received an anonymous tip about the condition of the property and had sent an inspector who had entered, documented the contamination in the upper floors and the basement, and issued the remediation order. The inspector's report noted extensive mold growth, rodent evidence, and evidence of unauthorized habitation in the basement. That last phrase is routine. It means someone had been living there at some point. It doesn't mean they were still there. It almost never means they are still there. I arrive at properties like this alone for the initial assessment. My company's protocol for unauthorized habitation sites is a walkthrough with documentation before the full crew arrives the following day. So tonight was the assessment phase. My job was to enter, photograph, document the scope of contamination, and exit. Standard 90-minute assessment. I got there at 1:30 in the morning. I know that sounds like an unusual time for an assessment, but my work runs around the clock and nighttime assessments in vacant buildings are common. There is no public traffic, no ambient noise interference, better visibility for the UV contamination detection stage, and the properties are secured, so there is no concern about unauthorized persons being present. Or that's what the paperwork says. The building was a large, older residential, maybe 12 units across 4 floors, with a full basement below. The kind of building that was probably beautiful 60 years ago and has been in slow decline ever since, each decade stripping away one more layer of its original dignity. The health department had given me a key to the main entrance and a key to the basement door at the bottom of the interior stairwell. I did the upper floors first. The contamination was consistent with the inspector's report, significant mold growth in several units, particularly along exterior walls and in bathrooms. The evidence of unauthorized habitation was present in 2 of the units. Sleeping arrangements improvised from old furniture, a cooking setup in one kitchen that was active enough to have left recent grease residue. But recent in this context means sometime in the past 6 months. Not tonight. Not this week, probably. The building felt empty. The building felt like it had been empty long enough for the emptiness to settle into the walls. I went to the basement last. The basement door at the bottom of the stairwell opened onto a space that ran the full footprint of the building. Exposed pipes on the low ceiling. Concrete floor. Old fluorescent shop lights on a single switch by the door, 3 of which came on when I hit it, 4 of which were dead. The space was divided by old wooden partition walls into several areas. What had probably been storage units for each apartment, some of them still with padlocks on their doors, most of them open and emptied out long ago. The contamination in the basement was significant. The mold growth was the worst I'd seen in this building by a considerable margin, running in heavy black columns up the concrete walls in several locations. The rodent evidence was extensive, and the evidence of habitation, the third item in the inspector's report, was immediately visible and significantly more developed than anything I'd seen in the upper floors. Whoever had been living in this basement had been living in it for a long time. There was a sleeping area in the far left corner, behind one of the partition walls, that had been built with considerable care and intelligence. Not a pile of blankets. An organized space. A mattress that had been dragged from somewhere and placed on a low wooden pallet to keep it off the damp floor. A wooden crate used as a shelf, with organized items on it. A battery-powered camp lantern, several batteries, a folded pair of pants, 2 canned goods, a water bottle. A second wooden crate used as a seat. The floor around the sleeping area had been swept, genuinely swept, in a specific radius, and the dust and debris were piled in a neat border around the edge of that swept zone, like a perimeter. Like someone defining the edge of their home. I documented all of it, photographed everything, made my notes, and then I found the bin. It was in the corner adjacent to the sleeping area, behind the partition wall, covered with newspapers. The mold on the bottom layer of those newspapers told me they had been there, undisturbed, for at least 12 months. I was moving them to document the mold growth on the floor beneath when the bin was revealed. It was a standard plastic storage bin, dark green, lidded. The lid was secured with a rubber strap. I should not have opened it. The assessment protocol does not include opening containers. I should have photographed it closed, noted its presence, and left it for the full crew to inventory the following day. I opened it because the sweeping bothered me. The care of the space bothered me. The organization of the shelf bothered me. The camp lantern with the fresh batteries bothered me. There was someone in this story who had put considerable thought and effort into making that corner livable, and I needed to know more about that person before I could set the story aside. And that need, in that moment, was stronger than the protocol. Inside the bin, a change of clothing, folded, a small zippered bag containing toiletries, an envelope, sealed, a roll of cash, banded, and under all of that, at the bottom of the bin, wrapped in a plastic shopping bag, a notebook. Cloth cover, dark blue, the kind you find in the office supply aisle. Thick, with an elastic band around it. I held the notebook for a moment. I put everything else back in the bin the way I found it. And then I sat down on the swept concrete floor of that basement, with my work light angled over my shoulder, and I opened the notebook. And I broke the rule about not reading personal documents found at a scene. I broke it completely, because from the first line of the first page, I understood that what I was holding was not incidental. What I was holding was the reason the space was the way it was. The first entry was dated 16 months ago. It began with a description of the building as seen from the street. The author described finding the basement access, testing the door, determining it was unlockable from the exterior with a tool he described in practical detail. He described his first night in the basement. He described the cold and the smell and the mold and the pipes and the way the fluorescent lights hummed when they worked. He described being grateful for it. I won't tell you everything that diary contained because it belongs to a person, and even if that person is complicated, the story of how someone ends up in a basement for 16 months belongs to them. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Job loss, then housing loss, then the series of smaller losses that follow those, the storage unit, the car, the phone plan, the relationships that couldn't withstand the weight of those losses, then the street, then the shelters, and what he described about the shelters was specific and not flattering, and I believe every word of it. Then the building. He had been in that basement for 16 months by the time the notebook was full enough to hold what I was reading. And over those 16 months, he had developed, and this is the part that took my breath away, that took it completely away, he had developed a system. A methodology for living in a building occupied by a property management company that sent a maintenance worker through every 6 to 8 weeks. He knew the schedule. He had mapped it in the diary, entry by entry, learning the pattern over the first 3 months, and then operating around it with increasing sophistication. He knew which lights the maintenance worker checked. He knew which door he came through and which path he took. He knew the maintenance worker's approximate duration on the property. And so he hid. During every maintenance visit, he hid. He had identified 3 hiding spots within the basement that he described as shadow zones. Areas where the combination of structural elements, stored materials, and the specific angles of the overhead lights created pockets of darkness deep enough to conceal a person. He described them in detail. He described testing them himself, standing in each one for 45 minutes, measuring how completely he was rendered invisible by the shadow. He called them, in the diary, his shadows. My shadows, he wrote. I live in my shadows the way other men live in their apartments. I know them better than I know any room I've ever paid for. I was reading this on the floor of his basement. I was surrounded by his shadows. The 3 working fluorescent lights above me were creating exactly the geometry of light and dark that he had mapped in that notebook. And as I sat there reading about the shadow zones, I became acutely, physically aware that I was visible to those zones in a way that I had not thought about when I entered the basement. The entry dated 3 days ago was short. It said, they sent an inspector. I watched from the second shadow. He was thorough. He will send cleaners. I have 2 or 3 days. I will use them wisely. He had 3 days. 3 days from that entry was tonight. I got up off the floor. I stood very still. I looked at the 3 working fluorescent lights, and I mapped the shadows the way he had taught me to map them without meaning to. The first shadow zone was behind the large old furnace housing to my right. The second was in the corner behind the stack of old wooden shelving units along the back wall. The third, and this is the one that matters, this is the one I need you to understand. The third was directly beside the basement door. The door that was the only way in or out. The door that I had come through and left open behind me. The door where I had not looked carefully when I entered because I had been looking at my equipment and my documentation checklist. I want to tell you I did something brave. I want to tell you I called out, and the situation resolved itself cleanly. What I actually did was stand up, put the diary back in the bin exactly as I found it, pick up my equipment bag and my work light, and walk toward the basement door at a pace that I will charitably describe as purposeful and will privately describe as everything I had. I watched the shadow zone beside the door as I walked. The shadow was deep. The angle of the light was exactly as the diary described. A person standing in that shadow would be completely invisible to someone entering or moving through the center of that basement. I reached the door. I went through it. I went up the stairs. I went through the building and out the front entrance, and I stood on the street in the cold dark and I breathed. I made a call. Not to my supervisor. Not yet. I called the non-emergency police line, and I gave them the address, and I told them I had found evidence of active unauthorized habitation in the basement, and I believe the individual might currently be on the premises, and I requested a welfare check. I used the words welfare check deliberately because the person in that diary did not need enforcement. They needed someone to see them. Then I called my supervisor and told him the assessment was incomplete due to a safety concern and I would file the full report in the morning. Then I sat in my van for 45 minutes, parked across the street, watching the front of the building. A police car arrived. 2 officers went in. They came out 17 minutes later. One of them came to my window. He told me the building was clear. He told me there was no one inside. I drove home. I filed my report. I described the contents of the bin and the diary. I recommended that before the remediation crew entered, a social services welfare check be initiated for the individual who had been using the basement, based on the documentation in the diary that suggested recent and potentially ongoing habitation. I do not know if that recommendation was followed. I have not been told. The remediation is scheduled for a crew that does not include me, and I will not be there, and I will not see the basement again. But here is what stays with me. Here is the thing that I cannot clean out of my head with any amount of time or distance or procedural completion. He mapped his shadows. He learned the light. He lived in the geometry of what other people did not look at. He existed in the negative space of a building that officially contained nothing. And when the inspector came, he watched from the second shadow, and he was not seen. And when I came, and I entered that basement and set up my light and began my documentation, I did not look at the shadows. I looked at the surfaces. I looked at what required treatment. I looked exactly where my training told me to look, and I did not look where he lived. He may have been there the entire time I was in that basement, standing in one of his 3 shadows, watching me read his diary, watching me set it back in the bin the way I found it, watching me walk to the door. And if he was there, and I believe he might have been, then he watched me make the call. He watched me use the words welfare check. And he made a choice in that moment, standing in his shadow, and the choice he made was to let me leave, and to leave himself before the officers arrived. That is not a ghost story. The shadow in that basement was not supernatural. It was a man made invisible by circumstances that I did not create, but that I moved through every night in my work, cleaning the spaces that circumstance has used and discarded. And tonight the space cleaned me back. Tonight I was the one who was observed. Tonight I walked through someone else's home without knowing it, with my equipment and my protocol and my work light. and I was the strange intrusion in a space that someone else had made livable through sheer human stubbornness. The basement will be cleaned. The mold will be treated. The shadows will be exactly the same after we are done. The light geometry does not change when you clean a surface. He knows that. He will find another building. He will map the new shadows. He will live in them with the same care and intelligence that he brought to this one. And I will probably clean that building too, someday. And maybe by then, I will have learned to look at the shadows before I look at the surfaces. He taught me that, the man in the diary, without ever having to be in the same light as me to do it. Look at what the darkness is holding before you decide it's empty. It almost never is.